Hello, everyone. It's time once again for Catalog and Cocktails. It's your honest, no BS, non salesy conversation with enterprise data management and beverages in our hands. I'm Tim Gasper, longtime data nerd product guy at Data.World, joined by Juan Cicada. Hey, Juan.
Tim, how are you doing? It is Wednesday, middle of the week, end of the day. We are live, and I'm super excited to have our guest today, which is somebody who I know that we were talking before, like we've been in the same room at the same time multiple times. I think we were just chatting. It's like, yeah, I was at that conference, but we actually never had the chance to chat. And that's actually Lindsay Murphy, who's the head of data at Hiive and also the host of the Women Lead Data podcast. Lindsay, finally, we've never had the chance to chat at conferences, but now we have a good quality time to chat now.
Yeah. Better late than never.
Finally, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes. And what I love about like having guests is like Lindsay was a guest shout out from Colleen last time. So I love when the guest shouts out a potential guest and we get them in. So really excited about that.
Colleen's the best.
So let's kick it off. What are we drinking and what are we toasting for?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a mocktail because I'm still going to do some work tonight. So this is a mocktail Paloma, which I don't know if you can get them in the States. I live in Canada, so these come we get them at Costco.
I have not seen that brand, Olay, but Tim, you've been doing mocktails recently. Which brand?
Yeah, I've been trying some different mocktails. Like recently, I've been doing the recess ones, and those aren't too bad.
Okay.
I'll have to try Olay. That'll be next on my list.
Nice.
Tim, what do you have today?
Well, I was musing with Juan and Lindsay just before we hopped on the show today that I told our audience that I would have a cocktail today. And unfortunately, I do not. I'm in the Capital Factory in downtown Austin, and they do not have cocktails on tap, although maybe I should make that request. But I do have an Austin East Ciders here and a very tasty dry cider.
Oh, cider! I don't think that's something we've gone into. Ciders. So.
Yeah, I don't know if we've had any ciders on the show, so it's maybe it's a first.
So today I was snacking on cucumbers before joining. I'm like, okay, cucumbers. Got to do something with cucumbers, and then gin, obviously, but not gin and tonic. So I'm calling this the Sweet Texas Cucumber Gimlet. So gimlets are usually with lime and a little bit sweet, but this time I'm using some Texas honey syrup that I made, and then cucumbers in this, and it's a Texas gin that I'm using. So
well done. Good name too.
Sweet Texas Cucumber Gin. So anyway, let's cheers to. We're talking about conferences. I'm just super excited. This weekend is Data Day Texas. Super excited for so many people coming to Austin. If you're listening right now, you can use the code Honest No BS to get a 20% discount. Thanks to Lynn and everybody for organizing that. So cheers to conferences, and we're all heading out.
Cheers.
All right, so I got our warm-up question, which is, what is something that you're kind of tactical on, but you should be more strategic about? Doesn't have to be work-related. Actually, let's not make it work-related.
Yeah. I think for me, this one is probably like personal organization. I feel like I've tried to over-engineer the solution to this problem for so long, and like moving from an IC to becoming a manager, it's like you really have to become more organized. Like if you're not organized, you just cause other chaos in other people's lives. So I had to figure out a way to get more organized, but I'd still, you never really crack the nut. I feel like every 6 to 12 months, I like want to redesign the whole thing and like over-engineer it or then under-engineer it. It's like, maybe you just got to be a little bit more strategic about how to focus your time and prioritize and not agonize over the details of it.
I share that one too. I mean, I think even personally, I've tried all the different to-do apps and stuff. And then at the end of the day, it's like, sometimes like what are you trying to achieve? Like even personally, what are your big goals and stuff? Actually, for me, it's like cooking. Like I enjoy cooking, and I do all these things that I like. And my wife is like, but we're always kind of doing the same thing. Like, let's think about all this stuff that we should kind of be trying, and we can change the cooking. So I should be more strategic with our meal prep instead of like, kind of like I can just get this stuff done right now.
That's a good one.
What are you, Tim?
Cooking is a good one. So maybe in a similar vein to that is reading. Like my reading tends to be very reactive to like, oh, somebody gave me that recommendation. I guess I'll check that out. But like, I think I should get a little bit more proactive, strategic about what I'm learning, like what skills I'm trying to pick up and what topics I want to learn more about. So that's something to get a little more strategic on.
All right. Well,
I'm with you on that one too.
Talking about being technical and strategic, let's kick it off. All right, Lindsay, honest, no BS. Why aren't data teams more strategic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess to answer that question directly, I feel like because of all the advancements in our field over the last 10, 15 years, it's like it's mostly been around tooling and capabilities around tooling. And I kind of think that that's changed the focus from like, what is the value of data to, what tools do I have to learn? And so everybody's focusing on, this is the next big thing. I need to learn DBT. I need to learn Snowflake. I need to learn all these different things. And so it becomes really tactical and you're in the weeds and not enough people talking about how do we actually use data to drive the business forward.
But so isn't this something that happens in all areas, not just data? Because I mean, it's like software engineering. I'm sure there's a new language coming out and stuff like that, but people are still getting their product, their software out. Like, is it, why is it different with data, or is it not different in data? And it's just like, that's how everybody is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I kind of feel like maybe businesses tend to like people feel a lot of ownership over data. Like I kind of feel like there's a lot of people who feel like they can kind of just dive in and like do an analysis and get an answer to things. People don't really do that with engineering. Like it's not really like somebody can just jump in. Maybe now with AI, but they can't just jump in and start building products and have opinions the way that they do with data. So I kind of feel like you're sort of battling against the business a little bit there, where kind of everybody feels like they have a bit of ownership in it. And you're kind of everybody gets kind of caught in the tactical function. Not really that many leaders talking about how data is like a strategic asset to the business. Like, what is our strategy? How can we use data to drive that strategy or measure how we're driving that strategy?
So is it kind of right to say that you're basically saying that maybe one of the reasons why this is happening is that, the business takes on some level of involvement and ownership around data. And so then the data team, like the team that's actually focused on the data, right, is, they get a little bit maybe pushed or relegated more to the tactical, or maybe even not necessarily tactical, but like technical side of kind of how to do things.
Yeah. I kind of think it depends definitely on the company, right? Like this wouldn't happen everywhere, but I've worked at a lot of startups and I kind of feel like there's like this pattern. I actually gave a talk at DBT Coalesce in like 2022 with my manager at the time. And this was something we talked about was like startups go through this very common path of a playbook of sort of, there's a first data hire. Typically before that first data hire gets here, there's been some data going on and people have been kind of just slinging stuff together however they can. And then the company goes through this sort of like evolution of standing up a data stack and putting all the pieces in together. But it kind of depends on like who that first data hire is. Like, do you hire someone relatively junior who can like take on all the day-to-day work, and then it becomes this sort of like support function of, people ask you for stuff and you churn it out? Or do you hire someone more in a leadership role who then builds out the team and the functionality? And I kind of think that model, the second description, is a way of sort of elevating the function and elevating data to a bit more of a strategic partner instead of just sort of, we need this number, we need this report. Can you pull this information for us as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so I'd love to kind of, sorry, Tim, you go.
I threw off Juan's flow there. That's a little bit counterintuitive, I would say, like the idea, because, a lot of times, especially when you're a smaller company, I know in a second, we should probably talk about bigger companies and how they end up in that situation, but especially with smaller companies, right? You want doers, right? And so the idea that like, you're going to bring in like a leader of data, you're like, they're going to come in and they're going to like make PowerPoint presentations. Like, we don't want that, right? So like, is that just the wrong idea? Like, should you target like a leader who's also a doer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do kind of feel like that first data hire role tends to be really good for someone who's kind of like at that next level of like, they can still do things, but they're able to kind of think a little bit more higher order. I think it's going to be really challenging for someone who's relatively junior to then get to that level. And then, yeah, to your point, if it's a really small company that's growing quickly, they don't really want to just talk about plans. Like execution is very important at a startup. So I do really think that is important, but I would argue that whether you start with the execution first and then you hire a leader later, that person's still going to have to come either undo or like force a lot of that service function into a new model. And so you're probably going to end up slowing things down later at some point anyway. So in my mind, it's like, why not build it right from the ground up?
So what I wanted to get into was, it's interesting how we just jumped into like the first hire. So so from a startup perspective, so this is the way I'm taking away is like, your first hire, you can either think about it, somebody junior can kind of just do the work, or is it somebody kind of more on the leader? I would call it more like, on like the player coach type of stuff, like setting up foundations. They're still going to roll up their sleeves and do stuff, but setting up the foundation. So when the second hire comes in, could be a little bit more junior and kind of set that up. So that's kind of how I'm seeing that from a first hire at a start perspective. Now, and from a, let's call it a legacy or just bigger, older companies that they obviously are already doing data work, but they probably have not kind of have well established data teams across. Like this is where let's just brainstorm your life. Like how would we start? What would that initial kind of proposal be of what is the team? Because I don't think here you can only hire one. You can probably start hiring more people. So what would that setup look like such that you are being strategic from the beginning? Don't end up saying you're being strategic, end up being very tactical very quickly.
Yeah. I think for that, in that case, like if it's a larger company, and I think this would apply to smaller companies as well. If there is a company strategy that's been built, and my dog is coming to join us. So if there's been a company strategy that has been built, I think that's really the asset where you start to piece that apart and figure out how can this company use data to support these objectives in the business. And so basically thinking about it more from a top-down perspective, and then planning out your team based on that, instead of, necessarily going in and figuring out how do all these different departments want to use data. That can still be important. That can be your bottoms-up approach, which is still important to do. But I think what gets skipped a lot of times is like looking at the strategy and then figuring out how does data support the strategy. So you're doing more of that data strategy work. And then at a larger organization, you're also going to have to think a lot about like the organizational structure and what it makes sense for a data team. Like it's probably not going to make sense to have like one centralized data team if you're working with a really big organization, because that's just not going to scale, right? So I think that planning that out as well from the beginning is like, what do each of these different departments or sub-organizations need? And then how do we design the data team based on that?
Do data teams that are more strategic in nature actually look different and are shaped different than more tactical teams, or is it just the roles that are different?
That's a good question. Like, I mean, I don't know that I know the exact answer to that, but my guess would be that probably a team that's operating a little bit more strategically could potentially be leaner. So maybe smaller. Again, it depends on the company, but if you are planning to service the needs of the business in a more efficient way, then you probably can run a smaller team potentially with higher efficiency that you're kind of pushing things back to the business. So maybe they could look a little bit differently, but yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to look different, but maybe it could be leaner, and part of that might be differences in some of the responsibilities. Maybe they're able to distribute a little bit more of that responsibility to the business, for example, and take on a little bit more of a strategic lens.
That's kind of...
And actually be really good at saying no.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
I'm not going to go do it. Sorry. I mean, you guys can do it, but we're not.
We're not building that dashboard.
Exactly. Yeah, and I do think that like the part of that pushing back and being able to say no is a little bit of this like being strategic, because you have to be able to know who you can say no to safely and who you should be saying no to, because they're potentially not using your resources in the best way. And if you don't know how your strategic objectives align to the business's strategic objectives, that becomes very difficult. It's like people come to you and, they're the VP of whatever, and they have an important title, and it just, you have to do whatever they say. That's not really how that works. And I do think a lot of data teams get into this problem where they kind of are open. They want to be helpful. They're open to answer any question. I actually think those are the data teams that are kind of going to get stuck more in the tactical weeds. And then we've kind of seen what happens over the last like few years where data teams start to get bigger and bigger and balloon, and their tech stack gets bigger and bigger, and they get very expensive. And then somebody comes along and somebody will be strategic for you. Somebody's going to ask about the ROI, and they're going to look to make budget cuts. And that's where, unfortunately data teams end up getting cut. So I also feel like, data teams who are thinking more strategically, thinking about how they do deliver ROI to the business and get closer to business impact, those are the ones that, are probably not going to have these questions of like, what value are you driving, and should all of you be here?
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. This is super interesting. Obviously there are versions of strategic data work that could look superfluous, right? So obviously it has to be meaningful, impactful strategic data work that's deeply kind of affecting how the business runs and is necessary, right? Like what do you see is like what does it look like for a data team to be playing a strategic role versus a tactical role? Like what are some of the things that they should be doing, and and why should they be doing those things?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing would be the flow of deliverables. Like, are you just getting requests incoming to your team that you're then actioning and pushing back out to the business, or are you actively pushing opportunities out to the business based on what you know and what you believe is going to drive the business forward? And I think that having it in the second kind of category of where you're driving opportunity for the business, that is definitely a sign that your data team is being more strategic. You're probably having conversations with like higher level people in the company, and that you're educating the people who actually, I did my podcast this morning. I recorded an episode that will be coming out in a couple weeks. But we talked about the stakeholder engagement matrix and how, not all stakeholders are created equal. And so if you think about a matrix of people who their level of influence and also their level of interest, the people who are the most influential in the company and the most interested in data are going to be the people that you want to invest the most of your time in, because they're going to be your champions. They're going to help you to get the resources that you need, but they're also going to help to steer you in the right direction. Like hopefully they understand the business really well. They are strategic themselves, and they can be a really good partner to the data team. The worst place to get stuck is in just answering all these requests and taking incoming information from people who don't have a lot of influence. They might be really interested in data and they want data to do all their work, but a lot of the stuff they ask you is just like curiosity, or they think they need it for their day-to-day, but it's really not that important. So I think that's a pretty good sign, is who you're working with and like the flow of information from your team back to the business.
You gave a couple of really good, recommendations that are very actionable here. Like I've heard a lot of like an opportunity matrix, but not a stakeholder matrix. That's I think a really good suggestion that folks can leverage. And then on top of that, you might be a top right stakeholder, but don't forget to ask that person or anybody, like, why? Like, what's the value of what you're asking for here? Because they might be like, oh, well, we need this for the board report and it's the most important thing ever, right? Or they might say, oh, I was just curious.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the things with the board reports too, it's like those always kill me because they're always last minute requests, but it's like, but board meetings happen on a cadence. We always know they're happening. Like, let's get ahead of this next time. But that also becomes, develop a relationship with those people so that you can get in those conversations ahead of time rather than waiting for something to come to you as a request,
Yeah. So this stakeholder engagement matrix, this is so spot on, and I'm actually I'm giving a talk on Saturday at Data Texas. I'm gonna go use this and credit due.
I'll give credit to Akia Abbas from Netlify, because she was the first one who introduced it to me. So
perfect. I'll carry you. So the reason why I bring this up is because I'm giving the talk I'm giving is how to invest in semantics and knowledge, how we can be more strategic basically around this. And there's a part that I talk about on incentives and really trying to understand and drive incentives. And then and this is what you're driving is exactly the point, is that you want to go find that people can be influential and try to and understand what are they trying to influence and how do you influence them? What's the behavior they're trying to go do? What is even from a business unit perspective, like what are their goals as a unit that you can probably help them, right? So if you're going to help them, then yes, they're going to pay your attention. And even personally, like, are they up for promotion? Are they trying to go switch to a different business unit or whatever, right? Are they trying, like, even what is their personal incentive and motivation? Because I think that's really important to be able to kind of understand those relationships. And again, all of that is being strategic. I mean, 100%. It sounds like the politics of this conversation I always have all the time is like politics, and you're like, oh, that sucks. Politics is bad. I'm like, no, politics is just of getting people together to actually accomplish a goal and trying to convince. Right. There are bad politics and very toxic politics for sure, but I mean, at the end, we're just trying to understand. I have an idea, a goal, and I'm trying to convince you about that. And you have your own goal idea, and you're trying to convince me about it. And we're just going to try to find things how we can get our stuff together done. So
yeah. I mean, I come. My background from a long time ago was in psychology, so I always kind of come at this from like a people aspect. And I kind of always feel like data is something that like brings people together and like helps us understand things in the same way, gets us on the same page. And data teams are a huge driver of alignment in a business, or they can be. You can also be a huge driver of misalignment. But I do think that's another big strategic function, is that, you know, your data teams are one of the only teams in the business that end up working across all of the teams in the, like, almost every single function. You know, some of the other ones, obviously, like operations and things like that, but like you get a lens on the entire company. You get to work with everyone. And people who, you know, might not be speaking the same language, you can start to call out like, hey, you know, you guys are measuring all this stuff differently. Like, how do we get on the same page? And so you really can become, you know, with things like metrics trees and different tools like that, you can start to become someone who isn't just a data team. It's like you're kind of the central knowledge of the business, and you start to get everybody on the same page, which again, like that's not, to me, that's not technical. That's not a tactical thing. That's a very strategic thing that you're doing.
You just brought up metrics trees, this I got introduced by Abi. Abi, looking up.
Abi Sivasalam.
Yes, Sivasalam, which he was a podcast guest a couple of years ago now. We actually did it live when we were together at Data Council. I'm curious, why did you bring that up and kind of and expand more on metric trees?
Yeah, this is something interesting. Like, we're kind of doing this exercise right now at Hiive, is not just the metrics tree as a concept, but also this like collaborative data modeling. So, you know, sitting down and actually designing a dimensional model with business stakeholders. And so sitting them down and saying, like, what are the business processes that you need to be able to measure and go through, and then building that into some sort of dimensional data model. Metrics tree is kind of the next layer to that in my mind, which is figuring out, you know, how do we ultimately drive revenue, or whatever your North Star metric is for your business, and breaking that down into the component parts of, okay, well, we make revenue by, transactions and then fees that get completed and things like that. Like, you can basically break down the components of how a business makes money. And if you follow that down and you break down all the component parts, eventually you'll have a document that shows you kind of like the entire model of the business. And if you get down into the details enough, you can then start to actually like circle different sections of the tree and be like, okay, well, marketing handles this, and operations handle like these things, and the sales team handles these things. And so it becomes this alignment document that starts to get everybody on the same page. And it's not really an exercise that you want to do by yourself. Like, this is something that you would go around and get input from different people in the business. But if that becomes, you know, something that you can document, you can then also turn it into forecasting or like weekly metrics review meetings and things like that. So it becomes an asset that is pretty easy for people to understand. And it's not just really then about the data. It's more about like the levers that the business pulls to drive certain outcomes. And obviously data is how you're measuring that. But it becomes more about like very simple mathematic formulas instead of all this like really complicated stuff. So it becomes very easy for you to communicate that to business stakeholders and for them to be on the same page.
Okay, so let's expand. You started off with saying collaborative data modeling. I think this is a topic very dear to my heart, and this is all about just the knowledge. What does this stuff actually mean? What are you seeing right now, like recommendations for data teams to actually start in that process? Because let's break it down. Collaborative data modeling, right? So data modeling is something that, I mean, we're not doing as much. We should be doing more. So yeah, shout out to Joe and get his book out really quickly.
Yeah.
And then the collaborative part, right? It's like another thing, that how much our data teams actually collaborating with other people, and then combine those two things together is like, well, you're usually not that collaborative and you don't focus so much on data modeling. And I'm like, well, now you should go do those two things that you don't have strength. So what are your recommendations for data teams to actually, this is an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, this is something that I've even been trying to figure out, because it's as long as I've been working in data, I think the word model is also just like so overly used that it just kind of loses meaning at some point. But people start to think like, oh, I built DBT models, so I've built data models. It's like, well, it's not the same thing as a dimensional data model or a conceptual model of your business. And so I've been very purposeful as we're starting to like move into a new phase here at Hiive of like, okay, let's sit down and actually figure this out. I will say that I have not kept up with everything that the content that Joe has out yet, so I do have to catch up on that. But one of the processes that I've been kind of reading about and learning about is beam dimensional modeling, and so that's business event analytics modeling. It's a bit of a process that you can follow to build a collaborative data model with your business stakeholders. It is like extremely, extremely detailed. It's probably like a little bit dated at this point, but even just the concept of getting together with business stakeholders whiteboarding with them, asking them about the processes that they follow in the business. For example, like the user onboarding process. When a user comes onto the platform and onboards, what are all the steps that they have to go through? What are the things that you care about? Ask them in detail, like what are the processes that you follow and how do you use data throughout this process? You can start to kind of uncover like really important events in the business, which then turn into fact tables, and then dimensions start to be hung on those different facts. And so by doing that process, we've done this a few times now. We've started to pick up and learn new things about like data tables and models that we've had in place for a really long time. We thought we knew everything about it. It's like, oh, there's all these details that we didn't understand. And so by having that like collaborative process, you're spending time with the business, you're asking all these kinds of questions, and then you're taking it and you can translate that into a data model design and start to bring that into DBT and BI tools. And then we haven't gotten there yet, but the exciting part that I'm really interested to see how it turns out is when you go and show this now to the people who helped design it, they were a part of that, like they were involved in that. And so I kind of feel like that will help with the buy-in piece of sort of like, maybe training won't be as difficult because people will have been involved in how we built this. And it'll end up being a little bit more proactive than sort of just like, requirement gathering, which is sometimes, tend to miss things.
Oh man. So I'm super, you are basically almost talking about giving the talk that I'm going to give this weekend. So this is what I'm super excited about. And so a couple of things I want to on board here. So I love what you said. I want to uncover the events that actually kind of end up being those fact tables. And you uncover these entities that are going to be the dimensions. And what's really interesting is that we do that work when it comes to analytics after the fact. And then it's just, we figure out what those are because we're gathering requirements. But if we're in that process from the beginning, you can start asking a lot of like, wait, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And kind of like start getting alignment from the beginning, so you can avoid having like, well, you misunderstood me, or we don't even know that we misunderstood each other, and we're assuming that we are understanding when actually the numbers are completely wrong. So I think that's a really great insight and aligns a lot with the shift left kind of opportunities, right? To go understand more of that. So my question is, who is doing this work? So we're talking about data teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's get more specific. Is like, what are the types of people who are in those conversations who are doing that, and how do you become that person doing that?
It's a great question. It's kind of one of those things, like I've been teaching myself this a little bit, reading a book and kind of going through it and just trying it, seeing how it works. It's definitely like a little uncomfortable at first because you're kind of like, I don't really know what you're doing. You're just kind of like learning as you go. But I think if you treat it like a brainstorm with collaborative stakeholders, so in my opinion, I think the data team should lead this process with the objective of going in and asking business stakeholders to kind of like tell us everything that you can about these different processes and being specific about each one, like working through each event very closely so that you can really narrow in on, probably a star schema around a particular event. But it would be, going and talking to the specific stakeholders who are really experts in certain areas or certain processes in the business. And so the way that we did this for one particular case was we talked to a certain group of stakeholders who are kind of more on like the go-to-market side or the customer-facing side of the business. But then we also took the same thing and we went to the product managers who are responsible for these features. And we had separate meetings with those people. And we got completely different types of feedback, which was great because it really just kind of added to the level of value that we were getting out of it. But yeah, like this is totally a soft skill. I don't think that there's really much technical to this other than knowing, do we capture this data? And if we don't, how can we get it? And there's even some cases in this where we started to uncover places where we don't have information, and now we can make product requests to add that. It kind of reminds me a little bit of like product analytics and how, when you're building a new feature, you're building a new, like I've been in data for a long time where websites used to be very static, and we would like develop event tracking plans of like, these are all the things we want to be able to track because we want to be able to build these metrics. And so we did a lot of this planning up front, and then we collected the data based on that plan. This is obviously a little bit backwards because we're building from like production data tables, but that's kind of the thinking, is sort of like figure out what the process is, what you're trying to measure, and then try to get the right data for it instead of what is the data that we have and trying to get the data to fit the other way.
Yeah, I like this much more proactive and empathetic, curious type of an approach. I think one of the things that data teams struggle with is they get stuck in kind of a build react mode. And some of that is even just due to the ways that we schedule the work for the data team, right? Like if you're I think many data teams use Jira or something similar, and they're just piling up tickets of things to build, things to do, right? A lot of times, some of this softer, more strategic work isn't ticketed, right? It's stuff that kind of has to happen in and around kind of the work that's in more of the technical queue. Have you seen things effective that help to either create time or prioritize time for data teams to work on some of these more either strategic or more, discovery oriented activities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of feel like, sometimes tools like Jira are a blessing and a curse. It's like by trying to like fit data into a box, or sorry, fit resources into a box and like measure them, it becomes like very difficult to try to do some of these more like, exploratory types of work, which in data can be some of the most important things you do, right? So yeah, I think like in the case of what I'm talking about right now, it's like the reason that we're doing this is because we're doing a BI migration, and so it gives us the opportunity to like remodel everything and kind of rethink our whole transformation layer. So that to me kind of feels like it's part of this big project. It's like some time that we
Broader
have to invest
initiative
up
it
front.
fits into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I can make the case of like, we can push some stuff off while we focus on this because this is a really big initiative. But I think from an ongoing perspective, what my hope is that as we start to have new things that are coming into our like scope of data, that we start to develop this muscle, and that we like start to actually account time for it in planning. So having a little bit of time planned into a project for this like discovery and design step. And so I kind of see it as, probably something that you scope out from a design perspective. And then, maybe it ends up getting a ticket at some point. But right now we're definitely not in that phase just yet, personally. And I kind of think that while you're learning, it's very hard to time box some of that stuff. You do want to time box it because you don't want to like go, just go full hog and read the whole book that I have and spend 5 years doing data modeling because it's a startup. But you do want to have a little bit of time to play around with it and figure out what makes sense and iterate. And then once you've got kind of, you've got a bit of your legs under you with a new skill set, then you can start to develop some process around it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And some data teams I see kind of experimenting with this, but not very often. I feel like it's still more in the product and software development realm, is like things like doing a spike. Like, hey, let's go explore something. Like, let's have a spike, let's time box it. You use that phrase, right? And go explore something. Or like design sprints, right? I feel like design sprints are done pretty often in the software side, but maybe not quite as often on the data side. Definitely larger initiatives. That makes a lot of sense. That, like, for example, you're able to use your BI migration as a way to say, hey, like, look, we've got this big strategic activity we're doing. Let's make sure we're doing this the right way, and we're not just like running into it headlong.
Yeah.
So what one of the things, again, this is actually I have a slide on this for my talk this week, is the urgent and important. So we always hear urgent trumps important all the time, right? So you have these important strategic things to be done, but there's this urgent thing because we need to go to the board, blah, 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 we need to go do that. And then obviously there's always these urgent things, so we never get to that strategic. So this is something I'm going to throw this out here because I've been talking to a couple of people about it, is have a notion of a tiger team that focuses on urgent stuff, and then have a strategic important team. And that the tiger team, who does urgent, they're going to do things fast, quick, and dirty. They're going to generate technical debt. That's okay. But then you have the foundational teams who are like who are doing the work that should have covered that urgent stuff, but they're not ready yet. But they're keeping track of that to know, like, okay, that requirement they did, yeah, we got that covered. Oh, we're going to go clean it up. And at the end, it's urgent stuff happens, and we're getting that stuff done because we need to do that, right? But we kind of separate that work, and then obviously people can switch around these roles. Does this resonate? Is that too crazy, or what do you?
Yeah, no, this is definitely something I've done with my team in the past. I think this also is a good service for urgent requests, but also maintenance and failures. So failure states, like if you're running DBT tests and your tests are failing, and then like no one's doing anything about it, like why did you bother writing any tests? So something that I've done with teams in the past is I think we called it like air traffic control or something like that, where it was like, if you're on ATC this week, like you're responsible for managing the support channel. So we would have a support channel where people could have, like, if you have an urgent question or an urgent request, you drop it in there. Otherwise it goes into a backlog and a process. but people would pick things up that might come up in that channel, or tech failures. So things that are kind of something that's failed or gone down, or test failure, something that someone needs to look into. So we did have a process to separate those things. I think what I learned in that process was like a week ends up being a really long time to put that onto someone, because then, more than half their time might end up becoming just that work. And so you do kind of have to think about, like, if somebody's working on a bigger project, that what is that rotation going to do on a small team to actually slow down some of your bigger projects, even though you're kind of spacing that out across the team. So yeah, in reflection on that, I think it's important, but I think you have to figure out the right way to separate the resources, so that you're not splitting people too much.
And by the way, you're just giving me notes of how I can improve my talk. So thank you very much.
That's awesome.
Actually, I kind of want to go to my next part of it. No, but let's go back on looking at the people, individuals. We're talking about balancing the technical and the strategic. What are your recommendations for folks who are just individual contributors, right? How can individual contributors also be more strategic, or should they just be doing what they're told and hope that their management is the one that are strategic and stuff? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is like being strategic about your learning and development. So I think in data, it's like very easy to just be like, I have to learn everything. I want to do everything. And to kind of lean into this full stack. And full stack, I think, is, being able to do all the way from data engineering over to even like data analysis stuff is really useful in smaller companies. But I think if you're looking to stay in an IC role and you want to, become a principal engineer or something like that, it's really important to do lean into those technical skills, but do it in a focused way. Like figure out what are the most important things that your business is going to need, and really start to upskill yourself and learn those different things. So I think for certain companies, if it's you're working with really big data, you want to focus on those certain types of tools that are going to help you grow in that area. I think the challenge is trying to learn everything or trying to split yourself too thin on the development side, or expecting waiting for your manager to tell you what you need to learn, those types of things. It's what interests you most, and then how can you lean into that skill set? And then on the softer skill side, I guess even though you're not going to be, if you don't want to be a people manager, it's still extremely important to develop like people skills and communication skills. Thinking about the types of things that you identify as potential problems and bringing those back to your manager with solutions. Those are skill sets that are going to be really important to becoming someone that your manager can lean on and see as a strategic partner to them, that are going to help you to get to those more senior roles, rather than just sort of it's great to be ambitious and take on whatever's assigned to you. But it's also good to come as a thought partner and someone who's going to help level up the team.
Yeah, no, this is the aspect where I feel that a lot of the kind of junior folks are coming in and asking about what should I be focusing on next? When I've been at conferences and junior folks come to me, they're okay, they're basically saying, I'm already overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. Right. So, and actually the ones I have great conversations with, they're already thinking about what is the next thing that is up and coming that I could probably get a head start and be the first at that one and get the best at that one. So anyways, this is why it's always an interesting conversation about kind of how do you upskill yourself. So I don't know, Tim, what I know you wanted to ask something about trends.
Yeah, well, just in reaction to what you said there, I feel like this is especially hard for ambitious people who are well, I want to do all the tactical stuff and I want to do all the strategic stuff too. It's well, there's still only 24 hours in a day. And so, I think it goes back to the comment you made, Lindsay, that you gotta figure out how to focus kind of your skills and what progression you're going to take as you go through this. Being full stack is not simple, especially as your organization gets larger or you're working for a larger organization.
Oh, sorry. One quick parenthesis for reminds you the episode we did last week with Jordan Morrow. He has this new book on Business 101 for data professionals.
Yes,
that's another call out. Is everybody should learn the Business 101.
Yeah,
understand what revenue is and net revenue and gross revenue, EBITDA, and all that stuff. Just, I mean,
that's what Akia was the guest on my podcast this morning, so that episode will be coming out soon. But we were talking about this of like at one point, like her data team is reporting into a sales function, and it's like that's such a good experience as a data team because it brings you closer to the revenue. It brings you closer to like how does this business actually make money, and the goals that you get set for you are. You're accountable to have some form of direct revenue impact. And so that's a lot of things that a lot of data teams don't have to necessarily do until somebody comes along and says like, hey, what's value you're driving? And then you might be in trouble. But I think that's a really good exercise is to have a lens on the business. How does your business make money? What are the things that the CEO cares about? And if you can deeply understand that, that's going to help you to prioritize your time and just think more strategically about how you do your job every day.
Yeah. So a couple trends that I'm curious your reaction to, writ large, but also like how does it affect, data teams being more strategic? Like, is it helping or is it hurting them to be strategic? So one of them, data product management. Is that, is that good? Is that idea and that role good, helping data teams be more strategic? And then secondly, of course, got to mention this, AI. Is AI helping us be more strategic as data teams? So data product management and
AI. What a question, that second one. I guess I'll start with the first one, but it's data product management. It's so interesting. I have not really done much. I've not spent a lot of time in this area or worked closely with data product managers myself. I love the sound of the idea. To me, it kind of feels like something though that has a place at a company where you're developing like really production quality facing data products. In my opinion, if you're doing mostly like internal analytics, like BI solutions, data products, like that to me kind of feels like, the data team could probably manage most of that unless you have like a massive organization and a really, really large footprint of BI. But I think if you're shipping data products that go to customers that are external to the business and have to be production quality, then yeah, I kind of feel like, that to me feels like the same as like a software engineering product manager relationship. So yeah, I am interested to talk. You guys should have some data product managers on here to talk about this because I'm not an expert by any means, but the idea sounds amazing because it means that you have somebody in between you and the engineers. But typically, like the data leaders like myself, I think end up being the data product manager, right?
Yeah, agreed. And we've had an episode with Anna Bergman on it, and she's a data product manager.
Yeah.
That was a good episode.
I have to listen to that one.
We should have more data product manager.
Yeah.
But the honest no BS is like, so how do you do this? Like, we're all figuring this out just right.
Yeah, we're all figuring it out.
I have spoken to Anna about her role before, so yeah, that's great. Yeah, awesome.
That's a great
episode. And then the AI, I don't know how to answer that question. I don't think that AI is really helping us be more strategic. I kind of feel like AI is just making more noise and making things more difficult to really see the quality of. Of course, there are definitely aspects of AI that help. Like I think from a productivity perspective, like I use GitHub Copilot every day and things like that to like help me do things quickly. There's still things where you have to be very careful about from like a tactical perspective, like what you're actually doing. But I kind of feel like, to me, the thing that really sticks out with me with AI is that it gives people the ability to seem like they know what they're doing, but they may not fundamentally understand what they're actually doing. And so with strategy, especially, like I don't really think AI necessarily has the capability to be strategic. Like that to me feels like a relatively human skill. And so unless you know how to prompt it to like give you things to help you be more strategic, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the outcome that you have. So to me, it kind of feels like that's a skill set that everyone should focus on learning. And then you can use AI to help you tactically execute on your strategy. But I don't necessarily think that it's like going to, build your strategy for you.
I'll acknowledge that before this, I was listening to the 15-minute rant you had with Joe Reese, and that was great. I do agree on that. There's like, we got to put some AI on this right now, right? So then it just becomes so distracting. Unless you do have a very specific use case. but then it's use case first, and that thing happens to be a way to support that use case. So
yeah, my favorite metaphor for AI was one that Ben Stansel did at, I think it was Data Universe in New York, like sometime last year, where he kind of he likened it to a Portlandia episode, which, like, I'm dating myself now, but it was put a bird on it. And so it's like the trendy thing to put a bird on something. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you got to look up the clip. But he said we're in the put a bird on it phase of AI, where it's like everybody just has to put AI into everything. And it was like websites. When websites first became a thing, it was like everything had a website and all of them were kind of bad. It's kind of like AI right now.
So gotta have a .com for it.
So I never got into Portlandia, but I'm gonna.
It's a weird show.
I know. All right. Well, before we go to a lightning round, this is great. I as always, I knew that we can always talk for hours like this. So I just want one thing to come up. I know this is what I love about doing live. So we're talking about stakeholder matrix. So one of our listeners just messaged me, Bernie Albright, who is actually a project manager. He's a coworker of ours, and he's like, he just sent me like a bunch of material about stakeholder matrix. Like, so here we go. It's like, so thank you, Bernie, for like listening and keeping us honest and no BS here. Is like, yeah, that's kind of like the bread and butter product management. I'm like looking at right now the stuff that he said.
There you go.
Yeah. So which brings up back is like, we should also be talking more to project management and stuff. I think look, the stakeholder matrix is the interest and the influence. So the bottom left is least important. The bottom right shows consideration. The left up is meets their needs, and the high influence and high interest are the key players. So which is what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyways, good takeaway here. We got to talk to our project managers because I think they know a thing or two about how to go work with stakeholders and people, right?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, time for our lightning round. Let me go kick this off right now. So, is data modeling a strategic activity, or is it strategic and tactical? Or I don't think it's just tactical.
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's probably just different aspects of it that are strategic, and then it translates into a tactical execution of it. So I would say like the collaborative pieces and kind of thinking strategically about who you need to talk to in the business and identifying the areas that you want to discover, to me, feels a little more strategic. Maybe the actual brainstorming and then translating that into data model designs, probably a little bit more technical. So both.
Got it. Tim, you go.
All right. Second question for you. So, just a little bit ago, you were talking about the trend on, I asked about data product management and how you see that affects sort of how teams can become more strategic. Do you think that it actually is only beneficial to have data product managers for when you have those kind of actual data products, or can data product managers be helpful for companies where really you just have internal oriented analytics?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably I think they'd probably be useful in both cases. I just question whether or not that's a full role at a company where you only have like maybe a smaller footprint or a smaller product. Like I kind of think, the skill sets of someone on the data team you should learn those data product management skills. It won't be your full-time job, but yeah, I guess it depends on your business and how much work you have. But to me, that kind of feels like it might become like a partial role that maybe a data leader takes on.
That makes sense.
All right, so I got this one. We usually do yes or no questions, but I'm going to change this one. So open-ended question: what metrics or OKRs or KPIs should data teams have to incentivize them to be strategic?
Oh, that's a hard question. Yeah, you know what? I will say that I have never really been that successful at having OKRs as a data team. It's been really challenging to really deliver on them, because a lot of times you build an OKR with the intent that something is going to happen in the business, and oftentimes you don't have direct control over that outcome. So I've a lot of times made OKRs that something would happen, and then we didn't do it because this department didn't deliver on X, or they didn't do this, and we really had no control over it in the end. So yeah, I mean, I think like maybe more tactical KPIs could be like, do you have a design step in your process? Like, are there certain things like that where you're following certain steps in a process to kind of identify, are you putting strategic steps and thought processes into things? But I don't know if that's really like a KPI necessarily. So I'm going to give you a wishy-washy answer to that.
No. I mean, this is the honest way, because
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be very. The honest part here is that I'm also thinking about this for my talk about OKRs. And actually, so here's an idea about a OKR that or some metric or something is, if we are designing data products, or we're designing data that should be easily reused, and people should easily understand this, right? Because it's like you're packaging it up with all the meaning, all the metadata, all the that implies that I should be able to go use that with the least amount of code. So in a way, I want to measure is how much was data used and how much code was actually used, was written to be able to go write that. So a metric I could have is not only adoption usage of the data, but also the amount of code that was used. And I would want that code to be decreasing over time if I'm actually doing a good job. Anyway, that's something I've been.
Yeah. But so to be the devil's advocate on that one, what happens if people don't have the resources to use the tool, or that it becomes then a question of, did we not educate them enough, or was there not enough leadership pushed down to make them accountable? Like maybe you don't have.
I would argue that you didn't understand your users and you didn't realize that they have that. So you did not do a good job enough to understand their users.
Yes. Yeah. So I would agree with you that I think you would have to be strategic to be able to drive those outcomes. So yeah, potentially.
All right, no, you're this is the sounding board. This makes sense. All right, Tim, last one.
All right, last lightning round question. Which role on the data team do you think is in the best position to be sort of the tip of the spear around some of these strategic activities, right? Is it the manager of the data team? Is it the data analyst? Or, who cares, right? It's whoever is going to step up.
That's a good question. I think, I think it can be anyone who steps up, but it's got to be somebody who's spending time with stakeholders, like quite a bit of time with stakeholders, in my opinion. If you are someone who is much happier just kind of like writing code and not spending time with stakeholders and not doing a lot of that stuff, I wouldn't say that you're necessarily going to be the right person or the right team to like drive that initiative forward. I think you really do have to be someone or have an interest in really collaborative skills and like being able to go and speak the language of the business. So generally, like those tend to be more of the analyst type people. But that doesn't mean they have to have that as a title, because you see so many, like I was a data analyst for a long time and has moved into more like the analytics engineering type of background and then further into engineering. Whereas, a lot of data people start out as data analysts. They're in the data, they're thinking about the business, they're thinking about the questions, they're speaking to the stakeholders collaboratively. Those are probably the people who are going to be the best at kind of teasing apart those processes and speaking to people to then collaborate on it.
A great answer.
All right. Takeaway time. Tim, take us away with takeaways.
All right. So we covered a lot of ground today, and I'll start off always with our honest no BS question. We asked, why aren't data teams more strategic? And you mentioned that, a lot of the advances in our field, and therefore a lot of the tendencies in our field lately, field being data, have been very tooling oriented, right? It's like streaming and big data and AI and machine learning and like all the things are around kind of tools and techniques. But really that can pull us to the tactical. It can get us into the weeds. And I think your big premise here is, hey, we have to find a way to make our data teams more strategic. We should be playing a much more strategic role in the organization. And we talked a little bit about why is this happening. You mentioned about the business sometimes may take on a lot of responsibility or involvement around data. So maybe the data team gets pushed a little bit to the side. Obviously, there's this tendency around technology and tooling that's been going on. And you gave this example of, companies when they're early in their kind of growth process. So we're talking like kind of smaller or growing companies here, and they're establishing their first data hire. a lot of times they're actually going to hire more of a tactical, perhaps a more junior person instead of somebody who's going to lead. And that could set the whole tone for the organization as it kind of goes forward, that, that essentially the data function is more of a support function, more of a reactive function. And so, we started to go a little bit into first hire, like some of the people that you bring into the company. You had mentioned that, bringing somebody who can be a leader, can be both a player coach, can be really effective. And if you could build a team and hire a group of folks, how would you kind of structure that? It'd be nice to have some people that can play lots of different roles. And when you think about the strategy, right, you should think about it more top down instead of bottom up, right? And how the role that can play in the organization, if you think of it that way. And if you have a more strategic data team, that team could be a little bit leaner. So it could allow slightly different structures around how that team looks. Data work, right? Tactical versus strategic. What does that look like? So, strategic work, right? Are you looking for opportunities to really impact the business or and align to initiatives and goals? Are you just receiving input and requests? You mentioned the stakeholder engagement matrix, where you could actually be looking at, hey, who is most influential and impactful in the business? And that can actually help you to navigate some of the politics and the prioritization to stay a little less reactive, get a little bit more proactive. And data teams are one of the few places in the company that really get to work with all the different parts of the company. And so that puts you in a unique opportunity to really be more proactive and see that bigger picture. And then you mentioned about some of these different techniques that you can use, that are tools that you can use as part of your more strategic activities. One of them you mentioned was metric trees, which I have a homework assignment to learn a little bit more about metric trees. That's very interesting to me. But it definitely centers around, it's kind of a way of doing data modeling around metrics specifically, and creating a hierarchy and a taxonomy of your metrics. But in general, not just metric trees, but data modeling writ large can be a hugely strategic activity, because you're working with the business. If you do it right, you're working with the business, understanding them, really kind of building the right data model to serve them. So there's a technical aspect, but then there's a really strategic aspect to working on projects that really make an impact. And that data modeling can become things like forecasting. It can become alignment documentation. It can become more of the information and knowledge work, not just the data and kind of piping level work. And how do you create the space for strategic work? Yes, Jira can be a blessing and a curse. You have to figure out, how you can do things like perhaps tie into a larger initiative, like the BI migration that you're doing at Hiive, and also look at, how can you do things like time box, but create space for exploration and iteration. So much more, but Juan, I'll pass it over to you. What were your big takeaways?
Yeah, so we talked to my dear topic, data modeling. One of the annoying things we all agree is like the word model is such a difficult word because it's overused. A DBT model, machine learning models, all that stuff. You brought up modeling, a business event analysis and modeling, BEAM, things to consider. And you brought the example, like let's go understand, for example, the user onboarding process. Let's go ask that in detail, right? So we're talking to the people directly who's doing that, who can explain that work. What are the processes? What data is being used? What is being generated? And you start to uncover those events, which become kind of fact tables, and then the entities, which are going to be dimensions. And then what's really interesting is that it's a collaborative process, so you can show it back to the users who are involved, and they also feel some ownership. And it's not just like a requirements gathering situation. So we talked also about like how is this work happening? And like, well, first of all, it is uncomfortable for folks who've never done it, right? So there's a lot of learning to be done around that, and we should really treat it as a brainstorming exercise. And the data team should be leading this. Being asking those questions. Tell me more about your process. It's definitely something around the soft skills, and it reminds you of, I remember the product analytics when we were doing things kind of for the web and stuff. And at the end of the day, we want to really is understand kind of the business to create that model, instead of like trying to create this model, trying to fit the data into that model, which is something that happens a lot. Actually, I wrote a LinkedIn post about this last week, which really got a lot of traction because of that. It's a problem that shows up a lot. We're talking about, should we divide the urgent from the important stuff? It's something I brought up. And you had this great analogy I never thought about, like have air traffic control situation. Maybe somebody's in charge of a week or less time about the support desk, right? Of like, we'll take all the urgent requests, the tech failures and so forth, right? But you got to be careful and balance that, because otherwise they'll be focused just on that urgent stuff. We talk about individual contributors, recommendations for them to be more strategic. yeah, in data, like you're really, it's very inviting to become a full stack, and from machine learning to engineering to analytics, all this stuff, right? And of course, you can lean into all these technical things, but you want to do it in a focused way, like really understand what is your particular interest and focus on that. And depending, doesn't matter if you're interested in technical only, you really should develop those people and communication skills, because even if you don't want to become a manager, they're just really important, kind of just to help with everybody who you're working with, identify potential problems with the solutions too. And also understand how the business makes money. So go read Jordan's book on the Business 101. And finally, on the trends, the data product management, yeah, it sounds great. It maybe makes a lot more sense when if you're dealing with data that is actually going to production, being sold. But otherwise, it's something that the data team should be doing. And when it comes to AI, we got to be careful, because the AI is not helping us to be strategic, right? Sometimes it can be more noise. Of course, it is helping us be more productive, but it's not going to go create your strategy for you. So how did we do? Anything we missed?
Pretty well. Amazing. Yeah. You guys take great notes.
Yeah. Well, this was all you. So, all right. To wrap up, 3 questions always. What's your advice about data, about life? Who should we invite next? And what resources do you follow?
Yeah, I mean, I guess on the theme, like my advice is to not forget about your soft skills, like lean into learning the soft skills. They're the hardest ones to learn sometimes. Sometimes you have to learn from experience, but there definitely are ways to lean into that. So don't forget about that. Don't just place technical skills as the main thing you develop. Who to invite next? Have you had Selena Wong on this?
No, from data culture.
Yeah. So
she's on my list. Okay, so send us to Selena. I think there's 2 people already who have called out Selena. She's on our list to go reach out.
Okay, so wonderful.
Yeah.
I'll text her. And what was the last question? I didn't write it down.
What resources do you follow? Books, podcasts, conferences, blog posts, people.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm a little bit out of the LinkedIn crowd now, but I've been keeping up with, I mean, Joe's got always some good stuff out on data modeling. So I'm excited to start diving into some of that. I know his book is coming out. I mean, podcasts, I ones that are not data ones that I think are really cool. Hyperfixed is one that is not a data podcast, but it is so cool. It's told in the most interesting way. And just as a podcast nerd, that's one of my favorite ones. So you can learn something new. People call in with problems and then the guy like solves them on the podcast. So that's my non-data podcast.
Love that.
Yeah.
All right.
On that.
Hey, Lindsay, thank you so much. I've really finally had the chance to chat with you like this. Love the quality time we had. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Hope
Thanks
to
for
see you
having
soon at
me.
the conference.